Welcome to a special RDA meeting. The Board of Directors of the Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City, November 28, 2017. And today we are specifically going right to agenda item B, which is agency business. And we're going to talk about the RDA budget amendment number 3 for fiscal year 2017-18 and the draft RDA housing funding strategy. I'd like to invite Jennifer Bruno and Ben Ludke from the council staff to come up and walk us through this outstanding staff report, if we could do that. And I know, board members, if I could also draw your attention to a handout that you have that is a supplement to the staff report that was a compilation of things we talked about over the past 2 weeks. So you have that as an update. And so with that, we'll have you walk us through it. And I'd also say that if we are ready to do something about it, a week from today, we may take a vote on what direction we want to go with this. Is that accurate? Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
So this is the RDA companion piece to the budget amendment that was first discussed in the council work session last week. There is an RDA public hearing scheduled for it next week because it is technically a budget amendment. It would transfer housing funds that are currently set aside for affordable housing in RDA to the Housing and Neighborhood Development Department. Their proposals attached, and we've been working with them to answer some of the questions that we have for clarification. Ben sent the next round of clarification questions we had to you guys yesterday, so hopefully you have that. We haven't had a chance to update our staff report with a lot of those questions that were answered. So we can either skip to the policy questions or however you'd like to handle it. Most of the details of the proposal were covered by hand staff last week. I think we're still working on clarifying some of the sort of technical aspects of the proposal, and so I don't know that I'm prepared to talk about those today.
I don't want to have us get bogged down in those details since we don't have all of them, or you just barely have received some of them. So I think it would, if you can walk us through the policy questions, that would be great. And on your staff report, that begins on page 2.
So the administration has clarified that they view these two proposals, one being the housing, one being transferring the money to the Housing and Neighborhood Department, and one being the RDA draft housing funding strategy that you discussed earlier in November, as two options for the board and council to consider in terms of how to spend these affordable housing funds. And so with all of those options being on the table, there is some overlap in the two options, but not a whole lot of overlap. We thought maybe walking through some of the policy questions on a broader level might be more helpful before we start getting into the detail, especially since we don't know all the clarification of the detail. So I don't know if we want to start with question 1 is just what is the goal?
Let me, excuse me for interrupting you for a minute. If there are things that it would be helpful for us to give you direction by taking a straw poll, will you ask for that and we can give you some direction if that's...
I think that's actually a good segue to the policy question number 1 of what is the goal for the $21.6 million in funds. We of course have a general goal of implementing the city's housing policy, and the council is currently working through the GROW SLC plan, which provides a lot of guidance, but obviously $21.6 million wouldn't go very far if it was used in every single one of those areas. And so given that it's from a specific source for a specific purpose, we thought maybe the council could start there. And Cindy, I don't know if you want to take over from here, but
just to insert one thing. Jennifer pointed out the administration has presented these two different plans and leaving them for your consideration. What we are finding as staff on the plan, the hand plan, it is evolving based on input from the council, probably evolving in a good way, but having two plans on the table and having at least one of them be evolving is not a recipe that adds up to the ability to expedite this process. So what we have in that plan is fairly difficult for us to understand and follow. And there's a major piece that I just really came to understand yesterday based on some more information that they provided us. But I think it's fundamental to, and I don't know if you want to do a straw poll now or to wait, but the way I would look at it is when the council appropriated the funding, we thought that what your fundamental goal was to grow the housing pie, to create more housing opportunities in Salt Lake City for any number of income groups, but to create more opportunities. The majority of the funding in the HAND plan is recommended to go for rehabbing or reconstructing existing units. So absent council direction, you could end up basically, instead of growing that pie, having the same size pie, but just changing which income groups, which people in the community get to have a piece of that pie. So it improves existing housing stock, which you always want to do. And if you don't do this program, you might want to create a program to improve the existing housing stock. But it could displace people who are also low income, workforce housing, workforce folks who are a little above or quite a bit above the 40% AMI, displace them in favor of housing the people who are lower than 40%. So fundamentally, it will help us to understand from you if a shift toward the 40% target, 40% and below target, is the fundamental goal, or if growing the housing opportunities in Salt Lake City is the target. They both have advantages and disadvantages, but it took us some time to figure that out. And so I guess I'll leave you with, this is taking way more time than we thought, and it's because we can't quite exactly follow what the proposal entails. And the other thing is we just need your policy feedback. Sorry that took so long.
That's fine. So I think right out of the chutes, board members, I'd propose that we take a straw poll on whether or not we think our fundamental goal is to increase the size of the pie. Anyone, Stan?
Just before we do that, and it's a question for clarification, and I'm just wondering if the staff may or may not have this information. Historically, the RDA has allocated 20% of some formula of revenue through the RDA over to the Housing Trust Fund every year. Do we know what that dollar amount is?
That funding was not allocated in the past year.
Right.
I think it was about $3.5 million before. However, it was split into project area housing, which was administered by the RDA, at least to my recollection it was. Hopefully that's right. And citywide housing, which in many cases was transferred to the Housing Trust Fund to be administered by hand. Sometimes citywide housing funds were still retained by the RDA to do a specific project that was outside of a project area, but yeah, just about that amount.
So Madam Chair, one of the reasons I asked that question is because we've had a history of supporting housing across the city with RDA fund revenue that and I'm not sure, I think your straw poll might get to it, that it was the intent of the RDA a year ago to just expand the funds to that same system. And that's part of what this housing plan and the year of discussion, I think, has been, because in my mind, the opportunity that $21 million commitment created was an expansion of resources available to affordability. And the challenge has been, I think, and hence these sort of differing plans, how do you define that affordability, and what role do we take in identifying the priorities for the need of that affordability? And I think we're hearing, in some cases, some would say that that we can never spend enough on 40% AMI and below. I think the same could be said for 40 to 60% AMI. We've heard really good cases for the need for permanent supportive housing, and also good cases for the need to shore up our workforce housing, which are different AMI levels. And I think one of the challenges from the perspective as a board member, council member, is that it becomes our responsibility to look at kind of that whole big picture and to say, is that 21 million, did we intend for that to go to one target demographic? I think that's kind of what Cindy's asking. Or was it our intent to say we see a pretty significant growing need across many of those, that spectrum of AMI, and do we want to try to address that spectrum rather than a very specific AMI?
Well said. Thanks for weighing in on that. Any other thoughts on this direction? The straw poll I am proposing is, are we in favor of trying to grow this rather than targeting it?
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
I appreciate what you said, Board Member Penfold, and I think that a piece of what we're talking about here is that we hear from hand that the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, is in renovating and bringing existing affordable housing either to a more affordable place, or by providing funding and incentives to improve the housing that exists. And it's really difficult for me to think, no, we're not going to look at what the biggest leverage for a dollar is. We want to grow the pool, period. Even if we get fewer units out of it, we're going to grow the pool. And so I feel like there's some sort of a compromise for me in there that when I look at the comparisons that is in the staff report on the second page, where we look at the programs and tactics between the Housing Trust Fund and the RDA, and the dollar amounts that are in stark contrast there, we really do have to. I guess I feel like I'm not quite ready for your straw poll, although I'm still working on. I want to hear from more of us about what it means if we say yes. Bottom line, we want new units. Even if I want us to have the discussion about what if that means we get fewer, or what does that mean for our existing affordable housing stock, just so that we have
That's what
conversation.
I'm looking for, is to have that discussion. So that's.
And just to clarify, the chart on page 2 was written at a time when we did not have the full information about the different tactics from hand, and so I think had we written that today, we would write it differently. The tactics are different than we understood. So,
Which underscores the problem we're facing.
Right.
That this is constantly changing and moving, and it's very fluid, and it's really tough to make decisions based on water, that it shifts back and forth and back and forth. Other thoughts? Yes. Cindy?
Just to clarify, when we use the phrase "grow the pie," which is not a professional or precise phrase, we are thinking of adding units, however many. I couldn't think of a scenario that would include coming out of it with fewer units. So that's what we were trying to ask, and I wasn't very articulate about it.
I think I meant from, if we said 21.6, even though we've spent some of it, equates to X number of units under a scenario of improving existing and building new, or it equates to Y number of units if we only build new. That if we only build new, I feel like what the information that's been given to us is saying you're going to get fewer units. But there's the trade-off of perpetuity, perhaps.
Right, and I think it's the total units. You might get fewer affordable units, but would you have fewer total units in the city? I don't know.
Well, and then-
Probably not.
Yeah, and so it gets to one of the questions I have too about, and I know it depends on the parameters, but net increase of units. And so some programs, a rehab program, for example, may not have a net increase of units, but what it may do is take some level of affordability out of the market to create another level of affordability. And I think I'm not sure how you evaluate that, but I think that's an important evaluation because I'm hearing these sort of conflicting goals. I see that we have a really significant need for 40% and below and permanent supportive and limited resources there. I'm not sure how much of that we're willing to give up at the cost of workforce housing, which I don't see getting replaced anywhere. And so I'm a little concerned about artificially creating another shortage in what we've kind of determined, maybe not through a policy statement, as a priority population in our city. And some of that gets addressed in conversations around type of housing, but I think you can't disregard cost of housing in that conversation either. And that I'm very concerned about creating shortages, still talking about 80% below or even 60% below AMI.
Other thoughts on this? I'm not going to take the straw poll right away on this. I want to continue having the conversation and then at the end do that. Does that make sense? Any other thoughts? Clearly, this is really complicated, and I'm with you, Stan. I don't want to see us displace people and have them lose housing and create a shortage for a different population.
But I feel also compelled to say that I think this is progress. I think this discussion we're having today identifies that our level of knowledge about these needs and the demographics is consistently increasing. And so I do think that's kind of, I think I feel a little bit, this feels a little weighty to me because I feel like we as a body have this responsibility to look at all of these gaps where some of our internal departments may be very focused on specific gaps. I think that's part of this overall challenge.
Erin?
I would like to go through the policy questions, and if we want to straw poll those, I think that might help us get closer to that
Okay.
straw poll you raised.
Andrew?
I think that the statement that Stan made that it's hard not to look at all the needs from 80% all the way down. And we saw in the analysis that there was need there was a need in one location. I think it was 60 to 80% or 40 to 60. I can't remember. It was 80 to 100. Somewhere in there actually had a surplus of units. But everything else we were at a deficit of units, right? And the choice is not necessarily, I think, between saying all or nothing. It's saying, what do we target now? We know that in 10 years we have to do all this. I'm just making up a number here, right? We have to hit affordable housing for all these levels. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. But right now, with this $20 million, what's our pressing need? And that's where I think this straw poll should probably go, is saying, yes, our overall housing hand policy should be about making sure we maintain affordability for everything 80% below or 100% below, whatever it is we hit, right? But then we have to subdivide and say, right now, for this money, what are we going to hit now? Because with 20 million, we get 800 affordable units. It's a drop in the bucket, right? But it's something. I think we have to just pick out and say, for this one, this is our priority right now, 40% and below. I agree with that. And then we have to set bigger levers and say we need more housing, period, across the city, and hopefully we can drive these stabilized market prices so they're not rising quite as much. And then look at, all right, how do you hit all these different levers? Because it's going to take different approaches to hit them, right? Right now we know that we have homeless resource centers coming online, and we know we have a deficit in housing right now. And I think that's where, in my view, that's where we go with this right now and say, for this money, we target 40% and below, with the idea that our bigger housing policy is all this.
I think the challenge for staff has been that without an identification of a long-term funding source, we're not clear that there is a second lever once these funds have been spent.
Sure. And I think that is a problem.
Right.
But it's one of those things where we can try and do everything a little bit, a little tiny bit, get 20 units in each of these areas, or 150 units in each of these areas, or we can say we're going to get 800 units at 60% and below, or 40% below. And that's the trade-off, right? Maybe we don't know what our next step is. Maybe we just have the idea, the policy statement is we want to keep affordability and get more information as we go forward. But I think we have to, I mean, if our question is, what do we do now with this 20 million? I think we have to be very specific and say it's not going to buy us a lot. Where do we target it right now? And that's 4% below in my view.
Cindy?
I don't mean to belabor this, but the piece that we really need to understand from you is if say your target is 40%, no question about it, in getting to that target, is it new units, or is it okay to convert units that are at 60 to 40? And so you can't answer that right this minute, but hopefully before this conversation is over, you can give us that direction, because honest to goodness, we don't know right now, and you probably don't either. So it'll help us to understand that, because there's that fundamental difference that.
Madam Chair,
Yes, James and then Derek.
I think for me, it's whichever is most cost effective. Whichever way we can buy down the units to get 40 and below. I mean, we know how much an average unit's going to cost, affordable, the buy-in. I think for me, so staff knows, it's whatever is most cost effective, biggest bang for our buck in moving forward in tackling that affordability.
Derek?
I kind of liked where you were going, Andrew. $21.6 million it's a lot, but it's also not a lot. And so I would like for us to find clarity in this conversation today so that we don't have to keep talking about this and spending as much staff time on it as we already have. I think we need to definitely move forward. I think, looking for cost effective projects and things that spend our money wisely is obviously always the best approach, but I don't personally, I would not like to see a unit that's 90% AMI or 60% AMI reduced down to 40% at the cost of that person who's living in a 60% AMI house. Like, I don't want to lose workforce housing or like middle income affordability at the moment. I don't want to create, like Stan was saying, a housing shortage in another area. So for me, it's all about, if it's 40% and below, then great, but not at the expense of other units.
So I didn't get that from the staff report, and maybe I'm wrong. I got that they were looking at going from market rate to affordable.
That is something that we've since clarified, that market rate could be sub-market rate, which could mean, even though, it's not an official low-income housing project, there's no tax credits as part of it, but because it's an older apartment building, it might be rented at 80% of what other market rentals are going for. Or 60 or whatever.
So what we're
truthfully, it would be more cost effective because you don't have to buy a new land and build a new building. And so that is this balancing test of, it probably is the more cost effective option at getting 40%. It is also true that it might mean you're displacing someone at 60% or 70% or anyway.
Yeah, and that's why we're so worried about this. We don't mean to be obsessed or anything. What we're looking at is a possible unintended consequence. And so the clearer that everybody is, the better off we as staff are, so that later we're not surprising you.
Well, I wouldn't want to take away the current market rate. I'm talking about buying down market rate to affordable, already built in current apartment complexes.
So you're talking about new construction or?
Current that's already built, or market rate, just buying them down to affordability.
And I would support that as well. But I also want to be mindful of this pot of money. This is coming from tax increment resources. And I acknowledge that RDA has been a funder of citywide housing in the past and will continue to do so. But I would really like to see this money go toward bricks and mortar as much as possible, and in areas that are already identified as redevelopment priority areas. So I think that if we could look at this money as an opportunity to invest in capital projects, that would be really important for me wearing our RDA board hat.
Charlie?
Thank you, Derek, because to that point, I think that when we're talking about the 21 million that the RDA board set aside last year, that doesn't have it really doesn't have anything to do with what HAND or RDA is going to do with housing. I mean, that is money that the RDA board set aside for housing. HAND can still continue to move forward with the plans, with the ideas, incentives, Blue Ribbon Commission, everything else. By not transferring that $21 million doesn't mean that that HAND is going to be unable to do their job. I mean, as of last year, HAND was having to figure out how to deal with housing without that money. I think I agree with what Derek's saying. I think that the 21 million that we set aside, that we've already used some of, but we're using it for land acquisition. We're using it, in a way that it still fits with housing, but it is also still, we owe it to our tax increment partners to be responsible with it, and not just to move things around and to use tax increment money in a way that funds something that's completely unrelated. I'm not saying that that $21 million has to be spent entirely within an RDA area, but I think when possible, it makes sense to do so. And I think that that it accomplishes a lot of what HAND is trying to do, but it also accomplishes what the RDA is trying to do. And so, I mean, my feeling is that as the RDA board, we have the obligation not only to the residents of Salt Lake City, but to our tax increment partners to ensure that the money that we've set aside for housing is spent in a way that is consistent with what they, as our taxing increment partners and residents, are looking for. And so, frankly, Madam Chair, I'm not supportive of transferring pots of money anywhere, and I'm also not interested in opening up the $21 million as a pot of money to the RDA. I think that what I would like to see as a board is that when projects that are going to use this money, when there is a proposal, that they come back to the board individually, and that we vet each of these projects individually to use that money with. HAND can continue to move forward, with the Blue Ribbon Commission and other housing incentive programs and tax incentives and things like that. I'm just talking about simply the 21 million that we set aside. I think it is a unique sum of money, and I think that there are a lot of eyes that are going to be watching this, and we need to ensure that we do this in a way that is fiscally responsible, that is transparent, and that we move forward in a way that can create successful developments as much as possible.
Thank you. Derek?
If I could just follow up on that. I'm trying to figure out why this feels so conflicting, and it's, I guess, because we have two competing plans here. And so I think this kind of gets to a broader problem that I see with local government, and that is, some of our problems are self-inflicted oftentimes. In this case, we have an RDA housing funding strategy, and we have a housing and neighborhood development funding strategy, and they're all both of them are considering the same pot of money, and so they're competing against each other in a way that I don't think is really effective to good management. If I remember correctly, 9-10 months ago, the board instructed city council staff to work with the administrative staff to come up with this, right? And they spent hours and hours and hours putting this together. Now, this may not be perfect, but this was supposed to be our starting point. with the housing money. And then we get this one from Housing and Neighborhood Development, which is good, and it's done by professionals, but this is chaos, in my opinion. I mean, this isn't fair to our staff, and I don't feel like it's allowing us to have the kind of policy discussion. It's just making us feel frazzled and stressed out, and I don't really appreciate that, personally speaking. And I've seen what it is doing to our staff, and I have no idea what it's doing to the administrative staff, but I can only imagine. So this just isn't good enough for me. And so I appreciate that we're getting down to the meat of it with policy and trying to get that shored up. But I want to just stop. I want to get out of the mud a little bit and try and structure this in the RDA capacity. And hopefully we can get some answers here today. But it seems like we're all we all agree on certain things here. We don't want people to feel displaced. I think that a number of us would like to see this tax increment dollars reinvested as to the best of our ability in RDA project areas, but that doesn't need to be all of the money. At this point, I don't really have an exact proposal that would spend all of the money, but there are things in the RDA housing funding strategy that I really like, and so maybe, I don't know, Madam Chair, what you think we should do outside of straw polling these policy questions, but I mean, maybe we could look at some of the proposals in this plan and straw poll how warm or cold we are to those individual proposals and take it from there. But I'm just trying to move us in a direction that gets us somewhere on solid ground.
Thank you. Aaron?
I agree that we have conflict here and that it's frustrating, but whatever. Let's deal with it. Let's pull ourselves up here out of the mud, however you want to say it. We have $21 million that we're talking about. It's a big freaking deal. And people get excited and departments get excited and proposals come out of the woodwork, and I wish it looked different, but it isn't. It doesn't. This is a unique thing. It's a big deal that we pulled this off, and we're just going to have to work with what we've got. And I think that the policy questions the staff put together, they're at the bottom of page 2 that go on to 3, are really basic and good and will help us to wiggle through the mud and figure out what we're going to do here, because making decisions on project by project, like Charlie mentioned, yes, down the road, I think that would be really nice. But right now, we don't have the stones of the foundation yet that we can build any project on. And those foundational stones are our policy decisions. And we're making them right now with the growing SLC, but gosh, I wish I wish that was 6 months behind us and we could say, look at this document that's guiding us, but we're doing it all at once. It's just what it is. So we've got to put some policy stones down here, and then we can talk about projects.
Dan?
Ditto. I just think I like the idea of going through those policy.
And with that, can't go over it, can't go under it, got to go through it. So let's want to have that conversation. So we've had that, and now we will turn it back to you.
So policy question 1 was written with the assumption that you guys were going to go through this handy sheet of much more well-written policy goals. And so rather than having 2 sets of somewhat mirroring policy goals between the council and the RDA, thinking that the council and the RDA would actually have the same policy goals, and then the 21 million would just be sort of an extension of that. So with that in mind, this handout that we passed out is the latest version based on your guys' edits from last week. And it really is an extension of policy question number 1. It's just more fleshed out based on your guys' last conversation. So I think, Nick, you don't have to lead, but I think, did they go to item 6?
So the council actually got through almost all of them.
Okay.
Except for the last half of page 2. We went back, struck the ones, I think it was number 6, the council did not want included anymore. However, we changed some of that up to be placed in number 3. And then just based on your comments, we've added the new information, which is red and underlined. So if you just want to, we could just look at those. Also, I guess items 17, 18, and 19 were newer ideas. that were not included initially, so we just took the council's comments and included those in as these statements.
So that we can have this on the record, I do want to go through these
Okay.
and confirm where you put council supports, that is accurate.
Great.
So let's go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Go ahead, Nick, do you want to? Yes, RDA board.
The RDA board might support the council?
They might.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Nick.
Okay, we'll just step through them then. The first one is adhere to federal level efforts discouraging the concentration of poverty in individual projects and neighborhoods.
Any need for discussion on that?
RDA project areas.
This, as you might recall from last week's conversation, this was a broad discussion for the housing policy, so it wasn't targeting specific.
Okay.
So these are the straw polls we took as the city council, so they're broader than RDA districts.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't, Councilmember Mendenhall might have been making a point that we should clarify.
Yeah, thanks. We were
Uh,
that how do we make affordable housing investments in potentially already concentrated areas of poverty, which are some of our RDA project areas? So if we say, yeah, we're gonna discourage concentration of poverty, then we inadvertently saying we aren't gonna build any affordable housing in a lot of our RDA project areas.
The way I read it is that it would just mean the mix of income would be emphasized in an RDA project area where affordability was a concern.
Okay, well, I think that kind of clarification
Okay.
might
Yeah.
be necessary in this one. Because I can see people nodding yes and nodding no in our audience right now with what I said. So that whatever, this isn't clear enough yet.
So the next one talks about a mix of affordable and market rate units. Maybe there's a way to,
Perhaps we can combine those two. I'm wondering, Jennifer and Nick, because I think what we're trying to say in one is that we're discouraging the concentration of poverty in those neighborhoods, and one of the tools is the mix of affordability and affordable and market rates. And maybe board members, it's more nuanced than that, because I think we've had both conversations. We've had very specific conversations as a council of not wanting to focus poverty in whole districts that are already overrepresented with poverty populations. So maybe we do need to refine this a little bit more. I don't want to propose, I take that back. I'm not sure I do want to propose combining 1 and 2.
so we will, maybe we'll brainstorm a way to address that nuance of in RDA districts, which already in many cases have poverty already concentrated, that would be addressed with a mixing of incomes within projects. Is that kind of, is that
And
what you're
there
saying?
may be other ways to address that I can't,
Okay.
smarter people could think of.
Well, Madam Chair, if I may, I think number 3 points to that, frankly.
Yeah.
About keeping an equal ratio across the city.
That's,
So if you take numbers 1 and 2 and 3, excuse me, where we are actively trying to have mixed income developments and have an equitable ratio within developments across the city, I think you address number 1.
So, Andrew, do you think that it's possible that right now there are already areas of the city that would say that they are already inequitably burdened? And how do they prove that? And who defines that? And we are saying in number 1 that there's a concentration of poverty in certain areas of the city. So is that
Well,
defining the burden?
sure, but I think if you're talking about places like North Temple right now, the problem has been the only new development is affordable development, period, right? If it was a mixture of 60-40 across the city, including on North Temple, it wouldn't be an unequal burden anymore, right? And that's sort of where I'm getting at, is that the problem has not been that we don't want affordability anywhere. The problem has been the only new development we get is affordable. Instead of other parts of the city would get lots of development and its market rate, certain areas would only get new development if it was affordable. On North Temple, that's what I'm talking about. So if you take number 3 and say we want an equitable ratio across the city, it means anywhere in the city we build, we're going to have the same ratios.
I think
And that means that across the areas of poverty or non-poverty to spread it out more.
I think we're on the same page. I'm saying that the baseline is different across the city,
Mm-hmm.
and that if we had in here of something about new development to be equitably mixed, I'm saying that we're already inequitable in some
Yeah.
parts of the city. So
Sure.
how do you try to build your way out of that, or do we just say that we're not looking back, we're looking forward? And I don't know what.
Well, I think part of me says look forward, because right now a lot of people move to my neighborhood because it was affordable, myself included. So if I'm trying to sort of get rid of that past, then I'm getting rid of my house, right? I don't think we go that way. I think what we have to do is target going forward and say, we made mistakes in the past, or the market made these determinations in the past, but we're not going to continue them. Where our policy is going to start fresh now, we're going to do different. And I say that honestly because parts of the city that are going to be redeveloped, we're going to be displacing things out. Things are getting torn down and rebuilt, right? I think in some ways, making an equitable ratio across the city, developers will build that, and then it sort of equalizes it in a large measure.
So if we added in new units, where it says uphold an equitable ratio of affordable to market rate, new units
Sure.
throughout the city. That,
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Madam Chair, can I have a follow-up question with Andrew? Andrew, one of the challenges that I think we faced is that as we define market rate, we tend to define that across the city, and even that's a fallacy because the market in one part of the city is very different from the market in a different part of the city. So when you talk about affordable in that context, how do you evaluate affordability in District 2 versus District 6?
I think it's incredibly difficult. I think you have to get really down in the weeds on numbers and look at tracts of land, right? Is it worth it? And can you get that information that way? Or at some point, do tracts lines particularly look very different than the rest of the city? And I think that's more of an issue for me right now. If I follow the tracts corridors and the density of housing there, the numbers, theoretically that becomes more affordable than other parts of the city that don't have that by numbers way. So I'm less concerned about individual sort of districts that way. I don't know right now that the market is that markedly different from, say, the west end of North Temple to Sugar House. I think it is different, but I don't know by percentage it's a massive amount. So I'm less concerned about that.
Well, and certainly affordability is changing in Districts 1 and 2 just in the last 4 years. That's changed
Exactly.
pretty significantly. So I guess that's one of the things too that maybe it's just a flag for awareness that when we talk, again, we get into this problem when we talk about affordability, we're using all kinds of different definitions. But if we stick to AMI, that might be partially how we address that. I'm making this up, but I'm assuming we're somewhere around a 275 medium household cost in Salt Lake City. I think I saw 260, 270, something like that. I'll look at Melissa. Is that where we are? It's hard to find a house for that anywhere in the city, but that's supposedly our median right now. And certainly there are neighborhoods where that's more likely.
Well, it's also because AMI includes the whole county.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. So,
Sure. I'm not opposed to new data that would be even more defined down to localities in the city. But I think I'm more concerned long term with infrastructure needs such as tracks lines, where that's going to have a much broader impact, I think, in some ways for our discussions than just general. Because where I live right now is not near a tracks line. It's probably not going to appreciate as much as other parts of the city where it's just the nature of it. We're going to have that across the city. I think that Our policy, though, should be something like this, where it's broad enough we can define it and then still give flexibility to staff members to make those individual decisions, because it's going to be tricky when they get down the weeds.
Okay. Does that give you some direction and you can keep going?
May I just read what I think we're supposed to say? And then you can, okay. So, discourage the concentration of, this is 2 parts. Discourage the concentration of poverty by including a mix of affordable and market rate units in individual projects and neighborhoods as a first part. And then number 3, uphold an equitable ratio of affordable to market rate new units throughout the city, so no one neighborhood is overly impacted. Is that getting close?
Yeah, can I say that the new part, so no one neighborhood is overly impacted, I would love to do away with that. Is that an impact of density, or could people read this to say that if we build affordable, you're going to be impacted, and it feels derogatory in some unintended sense? I know we didn't mean that, but could we just eliminate that last part, so no one neighborhood is overly impacted?
Yes.
Throughout the city. Yeah.
So eliminate that then.
We comfortable with that, board members? Second, okay.
And do you want the piece, ideally projects outside areas of high opportunity should have lower ratios of affordable units? Or does that go too far?
I love the concept. I think making anything actionable on it is difficult, because tax credits tend to follow those areas.
James?
I'm comfortable with leaving it in. I mean, all we're doing is creating opportunities for individuals that don't have the conditions to make their own opportunities. So I'm 100% comfortable with that.
Okay.
Did those 2 just say the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Next.
Okay, number 4. We were asked to change place with something like incentivize. So we went with incentivize affordable housing within areas of high opportunity.
Okay. Any discussion on that? All right.
Well,
Moving along. Yeah.
I think in
Andrew?
some ways, number 3 should also deal with that very directly.
With what? Sorry.
Number 3, if we have, if we're upholding an equitable ratio across the entire city, that means no matter where in the city you're building, you're constrained to that. So, if the incentivize is we're going to put money towards it, that's a different discussion. But I think 3 handles that quite a bit.
I mean, we have the $4.5 million that was set aside for areas of opportunity. It may be worthwhile to keep this statement in there.
Okay. We comfortable with that then? That understanding? Okay.
Number 5, no changes were made to it from last week.
Okay.
Number 6 was deleted. And then items 7 through 10, we had done a poor job of attempting to put those all into one sentence last week, and it caused a lot of confusion, so we've just separated them out so they're more understandable. So number 7 is incentivize the preservation and improvement of existable affordable housing.
Thoughts on that, anybody? Stan?
Number 8, it's a little firm. And as much as we've had this conversation, and I agree, I hate to create artificial shortages, or, I mean, I understand the intent. I'm just wondering if we should use some wording like avoid displacing existing or something like that, because
Something that's
I think if we said
less-
never, or which kind of is what this says, I think that may have some unintended consequences.
One of the consequences I made a note of is, would we inadvertently be keeping units from ever being upgraded or improved because we're saying you can't displace these people, and they say, well, if we're not gonna make more money, then we're not gonna improve these, and do we create slums inadvertently?
Right. Andrew, did you have a comment on that? I wasn't sure. I just want to make
No,
sure.
I agree. I think the wording just is a little
Yeah, let's
restrictive.
give us a little room to move on that, okay?
So remove that one.
Or
Just
Put
reword it,
avoid.
modify that, yeah.
It's more of a preference of
avoid
priorities.
displacing.
Avoid,
Yeah.
rather.
You can even add to the extent possible or something.
Yeah.
Well, Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think if we bumped number 9, create a net increase in affordable housing units up ahead of that and say this is a priority is to have a net increase, and then we prefer to not displace, prefer to those kind of things. I think of this as a priority kind of statement, say our overall bigger goal is not decrease the number. And then within those efforts, let's not displace when possible. Let's retain and expand diversity, those kind of things as sort of subsets of that. So when our choices have to be made, when I have in a building and I can either tear it down and build more, right? That's not an easy decision, but we say, here's our priority. Our priority is a net increase. Second is to not displace, and third is to retain diversity in housing types. And then we figure out from there a decision that's made on a building kind of thing.
Well, it's very possible that we may not see a proposal that meets every one of these suggested criteria, but it's what we're looking as our evaluation tool. And I think one of the things that is valuable, and we just recently did this with the Housing Trust Fund loan, is where we look at the opportunity and we say, based on this sort of agreed criteria, we're okay with this, even though it probably displaces current affordability, but it creates new affordability too. So that's kind of how I'm imagining this, is that it's our guiding principles, and it's every project's not going to hit every one of these, but we want them to try.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I just saw the net increase as sort of one of those foundational principles that probably preempts everything else in some ways. So, yeah.
Can I don't mean it to be a non sequitur, but I don't know where it fits in, that I would like us to, through the different funding, I didn't see that it was explicitly called out, but to contemplate some of the money being able to, whether it's through the incentivized rent assistance program. The RDA doesn't have a renovation program listed, at least on the document I'm looking at. And wouldn't it be cool if there was a way to offer low, no interest loans or grants for landlords of existing affordable housing to do improvements in exchange for preservation of the affordability of the units for some amount of time? And it's not doing rental assistance directly, but it's a counter to the slum possibility of there's no incentive for me to improve this and I'm not allowed to displace people. And we try to work on that somewhere in here.
Is that kind of number 7? Is that what it falls under? Or something different?
And I guess I want to
Actually, it probably gets to
Put money with it.
that the housing is the incentive, that what's improved is the housing, not just the pocket of the landlord that's incentivized, but that the housing itself is improved, and in exchange.
You're talking about the physical
Yeah.
facility itself.
Yeah, instead of like, we'll give you $500 to enter into this agreement to
And not
take.
do anything to improve.
Right. I'd like our investments to be tied to the either making things directly affordable or improving the housing.
So my follow-up question is, isn't that basically what we're discussing when we talk about not subsidizing or lowering the market rate on these affordable units already? We're just incentivizing them to preserve and to improve the already affordable units. So we're not having a net increase. We're just staying status quo, just improving the current affordability.
I think the distinction, James, is that we can create programs that encourage or incentivize improvements to structures that protect, for example, at a 50% AMI, but that's different than saying we're going to take that 50% AMI and we're going to incentivize them shifting it to a 40 or below % AMI, because then you displace.
I understand 100%. I'm just trying to clarify from Aaron that that's what we're doing, is we're not increasing, that we're just improving the affordability in those current units.
That's all I was thinking, and it's partially because I'm getting the sense that as a body, we're looking at the RDA package more so than the components of the hand package. And I'm not saying that's where I want us to go necessarily, but the RDA components don't have a renovation program line item in there. And I think that that's it, would be a good use of our funds to.
And if I could add, I feel like the RDA plan, as we talked about previously, is a starting point, and I would like to see a renovation part added to
Right.
the RDA plan.
And I think I'll just say in general, and Cindy can correct me, but our intention was that we would have those kinds of menu type, I think menu of options was discussed last week in future discussions. The challenge right now is that we don't really know exactly what's on the menu. So we're still
so
trying to define,
What you're doing now is
helping us. Yeah.
is fabulous. It helps us a lot. And so we know what you were saying, which is that there's a piece missing in the RDA plan. It's spelled out quite well in the hand plan, but you're adding a bit to it by saying that you want to enhance the housing stock, and in exchange for that, you would like to get some affordability out of that long term. Is that correct?
To tie it to the, what Derek keeps talking about, the perpetuity of our investments.
Historically, there are several opportunities, especially in the creation of new RDA districts, which we're exploring, to incentivize stabilizing people who are already there in their single-family homes, or stabilize the apartment buildings that are already there. And I think that might also help get to some of this issue about how do you incentivize affordability where it exists. And that's a future discussion, perhaps as an eligible program in maybe one of those or both of those RDA districts. That's something we can add as a programming component, Madam Chair, as we're having conversations about what kinds of programs we're going to incentivize in new districts or existing districts.
Okay. Plugging right along.
So I think we're on 11?
Uh-huh.
Oh, no, we're on 10.
Retain and expand the diversity of housing types.
I was thinking that they told us to recombine
Yeah,
8, 9, and 10 with number 9 as the first part,
right.
number 8 is the second part, and number 10 is the third part.
Sorry.
Might have made that up.
I see that as, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm seeing that as number 9 is the larger one, and then maybe an A and a B would be the other two, with 8 being A and 10 being B. So those are our goals there.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
is the housing types speaking to AMI or literally the physical structure?
Like townhomes versus, or is it all of it?
We need to probably get clear about
You
that.
tell us what words
Yeah.
to put.
Yeah.
We'll put them.
What do you think it means? What should
What
it mean?
did you mean with all that?
I thought of it as all of it, as
Okay.
variety.
Both AMI
price,
and type.
yeah, type. That
On
we-
number 10?
Yeah, that we want a variety. We don't want it all to just be studio apartments. Or all apartments.
Both have
just
come
one.
up in the context of RDA discussions in the last couple years of wanting to attract families to different areas. You can't build all one-bedroom condos to do that, and so having that different kind of types. And the RDA itself has funded some of those kinds of projects with
Right.
single-family homes and townhomes and stuff. So
And I was just going to say, I think the follow-up with number 10 too was the diversity of housing types. We talked about shipping containers, small homes, that type of thing as well. It wasn't just in regards to affordability. I felt like it was other different
Yeah.
types of housing.
So I think we should call that out, though, that it is
Okay.
both of those.
AMI and
You
type.
comfortable with that? Okay. 11?
Could
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
propose that we add innovative housing types?
Yeah.
Because we get at that in the growing SLC plan that we're about to get into, but We keep kicking around tiny houses, and it's not going anywhere, really. I'd love to build the possibility of innovative housing types, especially for affordability, into more purpose with this, or potential.
Express that this is concerning when it comes to the budget, and I think we need to. You already acknowledged this, Charlie, but the impact to the budget is serious, and so I am concerned there. But to Lisa's point, our foundational role is to ensure the public health and well-being, including public safety. And in light of Operation Rio Grande and a number of things that have happened in the city over the last couple of years, there really is a deficit in a feeling of safety among our residents. I hear it from a lot of District 5 residents when I attend Ballpark or East Liberty Wells community council meetings. It's, the feeling of insecurity is very real. And I think that this is an important step for us to take. But, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that this is a serious budgetary issue that we will need to address in the near future. But I'm happy to support this, and I'm happy to support your department chief. Anything you ever need, you've got allies in the city council.
I know. Thank you, Councilmember Kitchen. Councilmember Penfold.
Merry Christmas, I guess. So this is long overdue. And Chief, I want to make sure you hear all of us say how much we appreciate your efforts and your work and the challenge you face with reallocating limited resources and really taking a hard look at what our population needs are, what our sort of criminal activity is, and what is a sufficient level of officers for public safety. We are committed to supporting you in doing that, and I think that's the message we want to send to you, that we really appreciate your hard work. We, in particular, appreciate the work of all of your officers. They have been more visible in the neighborhoods. We hope to support that and increase that. I think people are noticing that. At the same time, we're seeing increasing challenges, and so this is a really responsive way to address what we're hearing very clearly from the residents of Salt Lake City as they support additional public safety resources. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, let's straw poll this. So thumbs up that we support increasing the proposed number of 27 new officers to 50 officers. Thumbs down if you oppose it. Yep. And that motion passes enthusiastically, unanimously. So thank you all. And so as far as the rest of the Operation Rio Grande budget in A12, if you have any other thoughts or issues on that, please let staff know, and then we'll be moving forward. This budget amendment is scheduled to pass, or scheduled to be voted on next week on December 5th.
There's a hearing tonight.
And there is a hearing tonight, so, okay.
Thank you, Council. Thank you very
Council
much.
Chair Penfold, I turn the gavel back over to you.
Thank you. I apologize for my brief absence, but we're going to move on to, I gotta find it. Agenda item number 2, actually, which is, and I should ask, do we have internet access back in? Just came back up. Just the timing is perfect. So, agenda item number 2 is an ordinance concerning a petition to amend accessory dwelling units related provisions. Welcome, Nick Tarbett, Michael Malloy, and Nick Norris. So, Nick Tarbett, you've been here before.
I have.
So talk a little bit about, as we left this discussion last week, we had a little bit of conversation around some potential straw polls. We're going to revisit that tonight. Our hope is to get through several of those to give direction to the staff as they sort of complete the proposal for this ordinance.
Yeah, exactly. So after the
Nick,
briefing,
and just before you start, I apologize. I know that we're a little behind schedule. We have some board appointments who I know are here. So we hope to get to you very shortly. This is our last agenda item before board appointments. So thanks, Nick.
So as you'd mentioned, Mr. Chair, we left the briefing last week with the decision to do some straw polls this week. Council members were invited to forward any ideas along, and hopefully we've captured these in the handout that you have. I had been asked to put together Councilmember Kitchen had put together a straw poll last week, and that was going to be the one we would start off with. So I don't know if you'd like to simply just dive into what we have.
Okay.
Okay, great. Do you want to just start? Council members, I'm just going to check in with you. Councilmember Kitchen proposed a straw poll last week. We didn't get to it because I wanted people to, think about it a little more. But if it's okay, I'm willing to just go right into that straw poll and start there. I think that could direct additional conversation. Councilmember Kitchen, do you want to speak to it again? Do you have a copy of it there?
I have the copy. Do you? Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to throw it out there and we can start there if that's what you'd like. So with the ADU ordinance proposal, I don't want this to have to go back to the Planning Commission, and I don't want to have to start over with new boundaries. So my proposal would be to stick with what was forwarded to us by the Planning Commission with the South Temple and 13th East boundary.
What's the south boundary?
I don't think there is one if I'm...
There is. It's
And
I think it's I-80.
It's I-80,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
So everything south of I-80
Would be included.
Okay.
Included,
You mean, right? So everything north of I-80 would be excluded?
North of I-80, but east of 13th East would be excluded.
Okay. So does that include District 7? I apologize, but does that include a portion of... Yeah.
A portion of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought the Planning
I know my
Commission
district, I
proposal
promise.
didn't include
Mhm.
that, so my mistake. All right, so my proposal, my straw poll request would be that we move forward with the boundary as proposed by the Planning Commission. I would like us to revisit the ADU ordinance at some point in the future. After conversations with City Council staff, it feels like 3 years is probably about the right time to do that. And then my pitch as well would be to remove the cap altogether.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Yes.
So are you, so when we revisit, are you putting a time frame on that? Do you want to do 3 years?
3 years, yeah, I think 3 years will be a sufficient amount of time for us to really see how this policy is working and where the shortfalls are and where